This is Lemmy with RevZilla, here to talk to you today about how to clean and lubricate your motorcycle chain. You should be interested in cleaning and lubricating your motorcycle chain if you have a chain final drive in your bike and you're interested in keeping your motorcycle's chain lasting for a really long time and keeping it from becoming a safety hazard. You're going to find these on all sorts of motorcycles, primarily older Harleys, sport bikes, and just about every dirt bike ever produced. While there are some bikes that use different methods of final drive transmission, the chain is what we're going to concentrate on today, and that should cover a lot of you guys out there on bikes. Now, as far as the difficulty of this task, I'm going to call it a one bearder on our BSD, or beard scale of difficulty. Most of you should be able to attack this job very, very easily. You should not only know how to do this, but you should be doing it frequently. Because of the frequent surface interval for most motorcycles, typically around 300 to 500 miles, it's really important that you know how to do this so you don't get stuck bringing it to a shop. It can be really inconvenient to have to go into a shop for such a minor thing. If you've got some basic common sense and a few specialty tools, you can get the job done all by yourself. Okay, before we start tackling this task, let's get a little bit of education in. You need to identify what kind of chain is on the motorcycle upon which you're working. Different style chains have different care and feeding techniques, so to speak. So there's two major types of chains. There's plain chains and then there's sealed chains. You'll hear sealed chains talked about as O-ring chains or X-ring chains or perhaps even a Z-ring chain, and long after this there'll probably be all sorts of other letters. But if you have any letter plus ring on your chain, it's sealed, and those get treated a little bit differently. Let me explain the difference to you really briefly. In the old days, all they had were plain chains, and plain chains, like all motorcycle chains, are made up of two types of links, inners and outers. On this chain you can see here this gray link is an inner link, and this brass colored link out here is an outer link. And they made chains for a long time simply connecting the two with a rivet or a stake in between them, like you can see here. At some point, somebody got the bright idea to help keep the grease inside of the pin and bushing cavity and keep moisture and dirt and gunk out of the chain. And they did that by using an O-ring or an X-ring, one of these seals you see right here. Again, this is why they're called sealed chains. The only real difference there is those are applied to the pins and they sit between the plates on these. Basically, they sit right here, sealing up that cavity. Again, keeping factory applied grease inside the chain and keeping all sorts of mud and muck from the roadway outside your chain. It helps those, especially who are bad about maintaining their chain, get a little bit longer life out of things. So once you've identified what type of chain it is that you have, you can figure out how to clean it. And the reason that matters is because these seals are probably the most delicate part on the motorcycle chain itself. Now, before I get started on cleaning, the first thing I like to do is inspect the chain and the sprockets. It's a good way for you to kind of examine some of the things around your motorcycle on the lower side, places where most of us don't hang out all that often. You'll notice too, we have this bike up on a lift. You don't need a lift to do this job. We're just presenting this to you that way so our cameraman doesn't break his back. I've actually got this bike up on its center stand, which you can see here. If you've got a center stand on your bike, it can be a real help. You can also either take your chain off to clean and lubricate it, or the other thing you can do is kind of chase it around the driveway a little bit, move it forward a section and do just a section of a time on the chain. Any way you do it is valid. This is just going to be the simplest way for us to show this to you. Now, when I'm examining things, I'm going to pay special attention to the chain and sprockets. Spurgeon's chain's looking like it's in pretty good shape here. One of the things I want to check just with basic condition of the chain is physically how much play there is, what kind of shape it's actually in. Let me show you off the bike a couple of better examples. Here's a nice chunk of brandy spanking new chain. This is in pretty good shape. If I apply any side-to-side pressure to this or any compression and tension, this looks pretty good. There's not really much slop or play. Now, in this particular chain, this has seen a lot of miles. Look at the wear in this. Side to side, you can see this wiggling back and forth. And then even if we apply compression and tension, you can actually see this kind of moving back and forth. And that's because as this chain was neglected over the years, the round pins and rollers began to get misshapen. They became ovoid, egg-shaped. And what that allows is, again, all that compression and tension you see here. Now, if you multiply that by the entire chain, there's all sorts of driveline lash. That's going to make your throttle feel twitchy regardless of how much effort you put into fueling. So this is something that can also make your bike ride a little bit better. If you're going from a really poorly neglected chain to something that's much, much better and you start taking a little better care of things, stuff like this doesn't happen. It makes your bike a joy to ride. So the next thing I like to examine after I'm done kind of taking a peek at the chain is also look at the master link. Now, this bike has what's called an endless chain. It's a pretty common setup to come from many of the factory bikes. If you look at this, all of the links look the same. However, on some bikes, there's a link known as the master link that might look a little bit something like this. The exterior of these links tends to look a little bit different. There'll either be a clip on the outside of the link that, again, visually looks a little bit different, or you might see something like some screw style snapped off pieces, or you may also see rivet heads that have been kind of peened over. They typically stand out because the link looks just a little bit different than the links surrounding it. You want to make sure that that link is in good shape. Whether that's a clip style master link and you're making sure that the clip is in place, or it's a rivet style and you are making sure, again, the heads are mushroomed over correctly and they look decent, you just want to give a quick double check to make sure your master link is still in place and doing its job. Now, moving on from there, I'm also going to examine the sprocket area. This can be kind of important as well. Chains and sprockets work together as a system, and while sometimes you can get away with putting a fresh chain onto older sprockets, if you have to replace sprockets, it's usually going to happen with a chain. Terrible sprockets and a new chain typically is a bad recipe. So when I'm examining the sprocket, there's a few things that I'm going to look for in particular. The first is what I like to call shark teeth. You'll notice that the teeth on the sprocket here look fairly similar from front to back. On a bike that's accelerated hard, but maybe not decelerated very often, or just a very old chain on a bike that's ridden fairly gently, the leading edge right here in the teeth can start to wear. As that wears, but the backside of the tooth does not, it gives a weird kind of a shark fin appearance. You'll get shark teeth, effectively. Now, compound this situation, and sometimes for those of you who are heavy decelerators, or perhaps you like to downshift often, you may notice not only the leading edge of the tooth wearing, but also the trailing edge as well. When that starts to happen, you'll get teeth that look kind of pointy. And the reason I say they look pointy is if you examine the teeth here up top, there's actually a pretty decent sized flat on the top of the teeth. As both the front and the back side of the tooth cavity wears where the roller lays in it, it sort of makes those cavities just a little bit bigger. They expand more and more until the point where this flat up here disappears and the teeth actually start to look pointy, and sometimes they can actually get so sharp they can cut you. If you have sharp teeth on your sprocket, it's time for a sprocket and chain replacement. There's not really much point in trying to maintain a chain and sprocket system that's kind of already shot. So inspection should be one of your initial steps as far as taking a peek at your bike and making sure everything is in good shape before you get started. Now we're going to get cracking on the cleaning process. So I want to remind you before, it was important that we identified the chain. And the reason we do that is, again, because different chains have different sort of processes for cleaning them. If you've got a plain chain, the whole thing is made out of metal. They're pretty tough cookies. I've cleaned those before in something as harsh as gasoline. However, if you have a sealed chain, as most modern motorcycles do, you don't want to use something like that. You want to check out whatever it is that the manufacturer of your chain tells you to use on it. And I think one of the things that you're going to find is that you can either use a commercial chain cleaner like we sell at RevZilla, or you can also use kerosene. A lot of the major chain manufacturers just recommend plain old kerosene. It's gentle on the O-rings, and again, it'll help give your chain nice long life, which is really the point of this whole exercise anyway. So to get started, what I'm going to do is start soaking down Spurgeon's chain and sprockets in some kerosene to get them clean. This does get a little bit messy, so again, if you have just cleaned your bike and it's looking great, you may want to remove the chain if possible. Then again, you may not want to do that. Either way, get the chain soaked down in kerosene. So I'm going to start spraying and moving that chain and sprocket to soak this puppy down. And I'm not going to be shy with this stuff. It's a dime's worth of kerosene. I want to get this thing good and gooey. The whole reason we're loading this up with kerosene is to help dissolve some of the existing lubricant, and then we're also going to get the dirt particles kind of floated up so they get up to the surface and get out. We're basically trying to flush those things out detergent style. So you'll notice here, this chain's already starting to look a little bit better, and the reason it's doing that is because we're knocking some dirt off. And as you do this, you're going to see dirt gathering all over the place. That's a good thing. Now, some of you who have exceptionally clean motorcycles can probably stop at this point. You may be able to simply take a rag, give it a lick and promise, wipe most of the dirt and gunk off of there. However, for those of you, again, who tend to use thick or heavy lubricant that can cake up, or those of you who really do get out in the dirt or the dust, you're probably going to need to do a little further cleaning. You're going to need to scrub this chain off. So there's a couple different ways you can do that. Again, if you're rocking a plain chain, you don't have to be quite so careful. You can attack that baby with a brass brush and clean up every little bit on there. Sometimes a brass brush can even knock off a little bit of rust if it's formed on there. Not too bad, but any surface rust shouldn't be a big deal. But again, if you have a modern sealed chain like this, you don't want to use something nearly as aggressive as a brush with brass bristles. Instead, something like a soft nylon brush is probably the way to go. Something like this. For those of you who like making your life a little bit easier too, you might want to investigate something like a grunge brush. I have to say, this is a product I really do like. You can see the brush itself has 3 faces here, so it quickly allows you to clean 3 of the 4 sides of your chain. Check out how easy this is. We're gonna fit this puppy on here and start spinning this wheel. And as I do that, I'm quickly able to start scrubbing this chain clean. I'm knocking the dirt and the snot right off of here. And this chain is cleaning up very easily. I'm gonna whip this around a couple more times, just make sure I got everything on here. And from there, I'm gonna take my nylon brush and get in this puppy and start doing the same thing on the top, the face of the chain that I couldn't get to with the grunge brush. You can always flip the grunge brush over. I'm actually not doing it here, just so you can see you can use a regular brush if you like to. And I'm trying to give our camera guy a clear view in to see what I'm doing here. So I'm scrubbing this puppy down. We're looking pretty good. As you can see, a lot of the dirt and muck is coming off this. I don't mind getting this scrub brush too on that sprocket and knock off as much dirt as I can. We're looking pretty good here. So what I'm gonna do next, you can see here before I get to that point, you can see all this muck starting to come off of this. That's a great sign. That's exactly what we're trying to do, is get the dirt flushed out of the chain. So what I'm gonna do next is give this another spray with some kerosene and start drying this off. Again, trying to float that grease out of there. So I'm gonna do the exact same thing. And if you look below the sprocket, you'll notice the big black pool of grossness that is coming off of this motorcycle. That's great. Again, this dirt and that muck in there, that's the stuff that kills chains, especially those O-rings. So what we're doing here is we're keeping those O-rings soft and supple, and we're removing any grit that can act as an abrasive to them. Look how dirty that thing is. So at this stage of the game, I'm gonna say this is a reasonably clean motorcycle chain. The next thing I wanna do is start drying this off. You have to get all the kerosene off for your lubricant to be effective. So I'm gonna get this thing drying. I'm gonna just use a rag. Be super duper careful here, watching your fingers the whole time. And that actually sort of brings up another mention. I have seen some knuckleheads who have attempted to do chain maintenance on a motorcycle that is turned on, and sometimes even throw a bike in gear. It's a terrible idea. Never ever touch your chain while your bike is on. The risk is just too great. Chains and sprockets are pretty good at injuring people. Make sure your bike is off, regardless of how difficult this job may seem. You're not gonna save any time doing it that way. So as you can see here, I'm drying this chain up a little bit, and it's starting to look good. I'm gonna give it a few more passes real quickly, and then we'll be ready to start lubricating. Alrighty, we've gotten lots and lots of muck off of this. I've cleaned up Spurgeon's wheel a little bit here. I definitely cleaned up some of the gunk and muck that had accumulated on the lift. And I also got the chain clean and completely dry now. You can see I can actually touch this chain. If you look at my hand, it's completely clean. That's usually a pretty good indicator that you're getting to the point where you've knocked most of the snot and gunk off of the chain. Now we're ready to lubricate. Now before we get really cracking on lubricant, I'm gonna again go back to that chain ID section of the video where we're talking about figuring out whether you've got a sealed chain or whether you have a plain chain. And the reason I'm bringing that up again is because the lubrication techniques for both are a little bit different. So let's kind of talk a little bit about the old days. Back in the days when everybody had plain chains, everybody knew that the best way to keep a plain chain living a long and happy life was to keep a constant stream of lubricant on it. The more lubricant you had in there, the better off you were doing. So plain chains really love a lot of grease. Slop a bunch of that stuff in there. However, for those of you with modern bikes who are rocking a sealed chain like this, the lubricant serves a much different purpose. Instead of having to load everything up with grease, you're not really required to do that. You're really just using a little bit of lubricant on the outside to keep rust off of things. Now those techniques are also going to sort of apply to what type of lubricant you may actually wind up using. So there's all sorts of chain lubes on the market, and there's all sorts of home brewed stuff you can use as well, and everybody's got their own opinion. In that respect, I guess it's a lot like motor oil. I like to use an item called chain wax. Maxima makes this stuff. I discovered this when I was about 17. It worked so well, I've been using it ever since. Now just so you know, I'm not standing up here trying to peddle you stuff. There's other things you can use too. Some of them are cheap and some of them we don't even sell. One of my favorites for plain chain is chainsaw bar oil. Any of you folks who run a chainsaw know that that stuff's pretty sticky. It hangs onto a chain pretty well. The reason I like to use the chain wax as opposed to something like chainsaw bar oil is that the wax is much less likely to fling. So as this chain is whipping around here, rather than it tossing off chunks of lubricant, getting your gear dirty and possibly getting your motorcycle dirty, the chain wax kind of goes on like a liquid in an aerosol form, and then it tends to get waxy. It's got a paraffin base in here, so it's much harder for the chain to fling off little pieces of the lubricant. So let's get right into the lubing itself. Again, when we were cleaning, we cleaned 4 surfaces of the chain. We're gonna do the same thing with the lubricant. Again, because this is a sealed chain, I don't really need to flood this thing with lubricant, but there probably is gonna be a little bit extra hanging out because I am gonna try and be thorough. So one of the things I think makes it easy is if you take your straw and just sort of direct it onto the sprocket, that'll help get that top surface of the chain pretty easily. We're gonna get some lubricant in there, kind of run this thing through until I see chain coming in that's already been hit with lube. Now we talked about heat earlier. Heat's not super necessary, especially with a sealed chain like this, but some folks do like to actually bring their bike out for a quick ride to actually heat the chain up to help draw this in on a plain chain. That's a valid way of doing things. So I'm starting to see some lubricated areas show up there. I know I've got the inside surface of this done. Now I'm gonna work on the outside surface, and this is gonna get just a little bit messier, but you can see the stuff going on. It's got that brown color, so it's pretty easy to identify when it's actually gotten onto a couple of the links. And if you look in just a moment, you'll see some of that brown lubricant showing back up, which means we've got that side of things done as well. I'm gonna repeat the process too on the top of the links, the outer portion of the chain. And then I'm gonna give them one quick blast here on the inside as well. It gets a little bit goopy. You will have to probably do some cleaning when you're all done. So this chain is now well lubricated. In fact, I would even say it's over lubricated. The fact that we see lubricant pooling down below here, not so bad for a plain chain, but this isn't a plain chain. This is a sealed chain. So we're gonna clean this stuff up. And then what I'm gonna do is take a separate rag here, and I'm just gonna wipe a little bit of the excess off of here, anywhere it's super duper drippy. So we're looking pretty good there. I've got most of the excess knocked off, but you can still see there's a fair amount of residue on here. Now the last thing I have to do, because I used a paraffin-based lubricant, is just wait a little bit for this stuff to tack up some so I can take it for a ride. If you used a strictly liquid-based lubricant though, this bike's ready to rock and roll. Now if you're looking to learn a little bit more about chains, check out some of our common tread articles on Final Drive. We've got a couple there that break out what methods of Final Drive are used on motorcycles if you want to learn a little bit more about Final Drive on your bike. And of course, if you're looking for another project to tackle, jump into our playlist, check out all of our great how-to videos. If you need immediate help because you're waiting to take your bike out on a ride for a nice sunshiny weekend day, give a holler to one of our gear geeks. See us at RevZilla.com, or you can always jingle us on the telling bone too, 877-792-9455. I'm Lemmy, I'm out of here.